Hello.
Good evening, Sheridan Almond, Mount Olive United Methodist Church, Randallstown.
Great, welcome everyone. We'll just get started in a couple minutes. You can go ahead and start introducing yourselves in the chat. We ask, just because there's so many people on the call, please leave yourself on mute. And yeah, we'll get started here soon. We're glad you all are here. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We'll get started in just a moment. You're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat in the meantime. And we just ask that you'll keep yourself on mute. All right, welcome everyone. We're so thankful that you're here on this Tuesday night with us. Welcome to Spirituality, Trauma, and Climate Resilience, a virtual workshop with Creation Justice Ministries. My name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm the Resilience Consultant with Creation Justice Ministries. I'm also a student at Duke Divinity School and the Nicholas School of the Environment. We have an excellent program here tonight, an extremely important issue in the midst of the climate crisis, for us to take on what it means to be spiritually resilient in the midst of the spiritual and psychological traumas present before us in the climate crisis. A couple housekeeping issues. As you can see in the chat, you're welcome to introduce yourself, say where you're tuning in from. We do ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the program. As you can see, we have about 150 participants right now, and so it's just easier for us all to stay on mute. We will do a Q&A session at the end, so as questions come up throughout the program, please put those in the chat, and we'll make sure those get recorded so that we can touch on them at the end. So to give you a little overlay of what we're going to be looking at tonight, here's our agenda. We'll start with an opening prayer from Reverend Leo Woodbury, and then we'll hear from Dr. Jan Holton of Duke Divinity School on climate trauma and spiritual care, from Dr. Beth Norcross of the Center for Spirituality and Nature about nature and resilience. I'll share some resources for spiritual resilience, some practical steps for you to apply this in your own contexts. And then, as I said, we'll have some opportunity for Q&A. So before I hand it over to Reverend Woodbury, I want to share the central guiding question that we're looking at. And some of you have been part of previous resilience workshops, some of you have not. Just so you know, this is the fourth in a series of resilience workshops. And we're asking this question, this central question: how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis? So in August, we started out with a Faith Communities and Climate Resilience Summit, and we looked at this issue from several different perspectives. In September, we looked at what physical resilience looks like, how we're able to start this process of building in our church communities. Last month, we looked at resilience from the perspective of climate migration and deep democracy, and what it means in this season of election and democracy, how that relates to resilience. And now we're looking at spiritual resilience and how we can tackle both the traumatic and the spiritual aspects of the climate crisis. So with that, I am very happy to introduce Reverend Leo Woodbury, and I have a little prop with me to help introduce Reverend Woodbury.
What?
And that's because for Reverend Woodbury,
Hey,
justice.
yeah,
So Reverend Woodbury is the pastor of Kingdom Living Temple in Florence, South Carolina, and he's the executive director of the nonprofit New Alpha Community Development Corporation. And in this role, he's organized Justice First tours across the South. That's where this hat is from. And those are tours that look specifically at environmental justice issues throughout the South and the Southeast. He's also the environmental justice chair of the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign. And he's a fierce advocate for environmental justice and a grounded faith leader. And he knows firsthand the devastating physical and spiritual effects of the climate crisis, because it's those effects that have impacted his community and the community he cares so deeply about. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Reverend Woodbury. Reverend Woodbury, are you on the call? Can you unmute yourself and offer your prayer?
hello everyone. Great to be here. And so we want to go to the spiritual power of the Lord your God, that deity, you know, that fills us all. And so let us bow our heads or close our eyes or take a deep breath, however we communicate at this time. Our Lord, our God, our provider, our nourisher and our sustainer, we thank you for this awesome opportunity to come together at this time in fellowship and in love. We thank you for everyone on this call, everyone who wanted to make it and could not make it. We thank you for justice, which is the bedrock of righteousness. And we're also thankful and we're also grateful for the opportunity to come together and talk about the things that are happening, the challenges, the obstacles, the stumbling blocks, the shortcomings, the hurts, the harms that are impacting all of us. But however, we have a spiritual power. We have a spiritual insight. We have a calling to do better, to care for the least among us, to care for this planet and everything upon it, to come together in one band of love, not only for one another, but for all creation. and we ask you to fill us with your spirit so that we may make good, just, and righteous decisions, not for our own vainglorious self, but that others may look around and see that the path of righteousness is the path that brings happiness and joy to all of us and all of creation. These are and all of the things we ask in your magnificent and mighty name. Amen. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Woodbury. With that stirring prayer, we're going to move on to our program for today. Our first panelist today is Dr. Jan Holton, who is the Associate Professor of the Practice of Pastoral Theology and Care at Duke Divinity School. Her work focuses on the psychological implications of trauma and forced displacement, intercultural dynamics in pastoral care, and pastoral care to marginalized populations. Her latest book is called Longing for Home. It's a book that I read over the summer in preparation for this resilience work, and I can personally recommend it as an excellent and insightful examination of the psychological, social, and theological impacts of forced displacement. And of course, we know that forced displacement is a significant aspect of the climate crisis and will continue to be a huge driver of trauma throughout the climate crisis. So with this, I want to hand it over to Dr. Jan Holton. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Avery, and greetings all. How wonderful to see such a wonderful crowd coming from all over the country. It's fabulous. Yes, as Avery said, I spend most of my research time working with refugee populations, often in conflict zones, but also the places where climate violence intersects with the most poor in the world, which so often creates forced displacement. I'm mindful today of those in Nicaragua who have endured a really pretty horrific hurricane. Last time I was there 20 years ago after another hurricane. And the numbers of whole communities that were annihilated and the tragic deaths that came for being forced to live on deforested lands so prone to mudslides. The people that I have learned the most from are those who are living in the midst of incredible uncertainty. And I have to say that that has shaped so much of how I understand spiritually my ministry and what I think much of our ministry is to those facing that kind of desperate circumstances, which now has become, in the last year, we're all having to learn to live with incredible uncertainty in the midst of multiple pandemics that are unfolding around us. So I wanted to spend some time tonight talking about the spiritual aspects of how we can frame ourselves, our ministries, to face the challenges of climate displacement and other forms of displacement that are before us. I've started using what I call theological touchstones in all of my teaching, all of my classes. In times of deep uncertainty, the idea that, we are very culturally prone to charting courses, mapping our way through something. But in times of uncertainty, it's pretty hard to chart a course. And so maybe if we shift our way of thinking during crisis to wayfinding, that how do we spiritually find our way through times that are despairing, perhaps, and certainly uncertain. So let me name these for you, and at the risk of giving more breadth and depth, I will dip into the first three of these and just a word or two on the last two. So let me list them for you. The first is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. Tolerating ambiguity. Second is hope. Hope. The third is meaning making. Fourth is joy. 5 is redefining resilience. And I list it last, but it really frames all of the others. That is justice making. And if someone has those written down and can add them to the chat, that might be helpful. I don't yet have the ability to do both at the same time. Thank you. So let me start with, if I can, briefly reading the scripture. We are used to hearing it at Easter, but it makes a point that I think is really helpful. It's out of Mark chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early in the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he has gone ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Terror and amazement seized them. They are standing on the threshold of the utter ambiguity, right, of a risen Christ who is not dead and not alive. And we hear the words terror and amazement. That has captured me ever since this past spring when I heard this scripture. Perhaps it was the context of this pandemic. It's just such a perfect description of the flip sides, I think, of uncertainty as people of faith. So much of ministry, I think, is helping people navigate these times of uncertainty, of crisis and uncertainty. And it is terrifying. There's no question around that. But if we don't learn how to move through that without certain answers, right? We look for sure and certain answers when things are in upheaval. But if we don't learn to tolerate that ambiguity, we stay on the fear side, on the terror side. I want to, it helps us. So ambiguity is one thing, it's uncertainty, but it's also, we could reframe that to call it mystery. And theologically, mystery is the place where hope lives for us. So pastoral theologian Kathleen Grider says, from a theological point of view, ambiguity's richness of possibility and meaning leads us toward that which is holy. That is the amazement side of ambiguity, right? If we stay in the terror side, we are not able to see the amazing things that God does for us in moments of terrible uncertainty. So what really helps shape our ability to stand in those places of uncertainty, especially when they are so overwhelmingly devastating, right? That when we think about whether it's the pandemic or our vision for what might be 10 years or 20 years from now if we do not do something to stop the devastation through climate change. It's a fearful place to be. But the things that we can hold on to, those touchstones that help us find the way through. Let's start with hope. Now, tolerating ambiguity is a touchstone, but really these other things feed into it. So Andrew Lester, I use his work all the time, Hope in Pastoral Care and Counseling. He sees hope in our future stories, in our ability to see into the future. Well, that's kind of obvious, right? We hope, our hope is always for something that is yet to come. And he says some things, there's some characteristics of hope that we need to hold on to. It's always based in reality. It's functional, right? It is communal. I hope in thee for us, Gabriel Marcel. When I say functional, this is what I mean. It allows one to see the givens in a situation and revise the future story. Obviously, it's future-oriented if we're talking about future stories, and it requires imagination to be able to see into and imagine something. Now, interestingly enough, the greatest despair does not come from a future story filled with despair, not necessarily. It comes from the inability to see a future story at all. For if we can see a despairing future story, it's possible that we can revision that to a hopeful future story. So I urge us all, when we hear the despairing future story, not to give way to hopelessness or think that we already have, that we have the power to reshape the vision of what that story is. Often, especially in pastoral care, we think about standing with people in the times of unknown and crises and ask the question, where is God in this story? Stories and hopes is another hope that is grounded in something greater than us, that is the God that we worship. That when we ask the question, where is God in this? It's not a bad question, but what it does is it shrinks God down to the story of our life. What if we change that story to, where is this story in the larger narrative of God's redeeming love and justice? That helps us ground our hope in something larger than who we are. And to say, even in times like this is not bigger than God. Right? God is bigger than this. All right, I want to shift to meaning making. So understanding what meaning making is. A lot of research been done, especially recently, on meaning making and what it is. The tenets of meaning making are sort of some basic assumptions that people possess an orienting system. It's what we do, right? We have a framework, a cognitive framework to make sense of things, whatever it is, that we are meaning-making people. We try to find and pull it together, an understanding of it. And when we face a situation that has challenges or stresses to this, it's called a global meaning system, right? It's that cognitive structure that we have for ourselves. We assess this new situation, whatever crisis it is in front of us, and we assign some meaning to it. Right? Now, so the extent to which this meaning that we've derived in this crisis matches our global orienting system, right? The degree to which it matches or the discrepancies between the two, right, lead to the amount of, correlate to the amount of distress that we have. Makes sense, right? If this matches my core meaning making system, then okay, I'm all right. But, and this is so key to trauma, assumptions. Shattered Assumptions is a wonderful book on trauma that talks about these core assumptions that we have, or meaning, the way that we make meaning out of the world, and sometimes how that gets shattered in trauma. But so the distress that initiates this, this distress that we have when those cognitive frames don't work, right? It pushes us into meaning making. We have to find a way to make sense out of it, right? We have to revise our meaning making system, or our meaning system. So when it's successful, it leads to just better adjustment and to a less stressful events, right? For people of faith, very often our meaning structure is grounded in these narratives of God and how God moves in the world. But they're very often embedded in, come out of what we call embedded theologies. These are theologies that are unexamined, right? We all learn them, right? We learn them from grandma, the prayers that we heard as a child, to Touched by an Angel on TV, if you remember that show, to our Sunday school as a child, these embedded beliefs that come rushing to the front when we're in crisis. But if we don't take those out and examine them, they can be detrimental to how we make meaning out of something, or our ability to do that. So as religious leaders, lay leaders, ordained leaders, to help people make sense, to pull out those embedded theologies, to help them make a new, more examined and in-depth theology. Let me go, I know we're running short on time. Let me talk about joy for a minute. I don't want to leave without joy, and then we'll leave the other two for other conversation. It's hard to think about joy in despairing times, or in times of pandemics or forced displacement or despair. But I want to make a case for joy being an essential aspect of how we move through those times with hope. Now I want to redefine it perhaps a bit to say joy is not an emotion, as we often think of it as, but to reframe it as a spiritual disposition that can be cultivated and needs to be cultivated. Cultere, I think, is the Latin word that cultivated comes out of, is to live into or to inhabit a spirit of joyfulness. Mary Michelle Clark has written a wonderful book on joy, and particularly joy in suffering, that they can go together. They are not opposites. Joy offers avenues of deeper understanding of God's goodness and love that can free us from the paralysis of fear or despair. Greg Ellison at Emory University, who is a pastoral theologian, says this. He says that joy is the divine inbreaking to which we can attribute the ways that joy can do these things. These are the note-taking things. Reorients our perspective, reinvigorates our convictions, redefines how we see the world and how it claims us, and brings vitality and vibrancy, that life force energy, to our encounters with the world, especially in times of hardship and struggle. Okay. The last two, redefining resilience, and we're going to talk about resilience again in just a minute. I would just add this piece, which is, I define it often as the ability to struggle well. Struggle is always with us, but to struggle well, to use our resources to struggle well, is perhaps a more hopeful definition than some that we have. And justice making, again, frames all of the others. I realize I'm out of time and have probably gone over, so my apologies for that. Again, I hate to shortchange justice making, but I think we're going to come back around to it more than once here. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Holton. And you're right on time, so no worries about being over. Thank you for that. Wow, thank you for those theological touchstones. these 6 places we can continue to look as we think about trauma and spirituality and climate resilience, and particularly holding on to your definition of resilience as struggling well, because I think that really gets to the heart of what we're trying to do here. Thank you. Again, if you have questions for Dr. Holton, please pop those in the chat and we can get back around to those at the end. Now we'll move on to our next trainer and presenter, who is Dr. Beth Norcross. Beth is the founder and director of the Center for Spirituality and Nature in Arlington, Virginia. She's also adjunct faculty at Wesley Theological Seminary, where she teaches classes on greening your congregation, creation care, and eco-justice. Her Center for Spirituality and Nature offers intimate experiences in nature designed to deepen spirituality and develop loving relationships with God and all creatures. Beth was trained in ecology at Duke and theology at Wesley Theological Seminary. And I can say from a personal standpoint that she is a dear colleague and mentor of mine, and I know she has a lot to share with us on nature as resilience. So I'll hand it over to Beth.
Thank you, Avery, and thank you, Dr. Holton. We did not coordinate our presentations, but there's so much overlap, and it's so great to see so many faces. My first response was to get my mask, but I realized I didn't need it. Let me see if we can make the technology work here. I hope you're seeing my screen, Avery.
Yes, it is up.
So as we talk about spiritual resilience, doesn't mean to go out into the natural world to seek it, to look for it, to track it, to be open to it. Avery was kind enough to introduce our center, so I'll keep moving here. What I'd like to do in the few minutes we have together is talk about a little bit about what do we mean by spiritual resilience? What do I mean for the purposes of this presentation? And how can nature help us to be spiritually resilient? Well, I'm informed by the work of Sam Chase and the Kripalu Institute up in the Berkshires. He talks a lot about resilience. They're doing a lot of work up there. One of the things he talks about is resilience is showing up. And I love this construct. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how spiritual resilience is showing up. And by that, I mean being fully present to this moment, individually and communally, and being open, as Dr. Holton said, to see all of what we are facing, to open ourselves bravely to it, to see it and accept it for all of the difficulties of it, but also the potential for transformation. It also means showing up and being present and learning to manage and accept these very difficult emotions that come up, as Dr. Holton said, this terror and ambiguity that many of us might be feeling, fear, anxiety, anger, rage, sadness. I would say that showing up is also reaching deep within ourselves to realize what one might call our resilience potential, the courage, the strength, the wisdom that we may not even be aware of. And finally, and probably most importantly, showing up by being willing to empty ourselves so that we might meet God in this moment. Empty ourselves, move beyond the emotions, through the feelings, emptying ourselves of those, emptying ourselves perhaps even of expectations. Kenosis, many of you are familiar with this concept, so that we might meet God there. So how does time in nature help us to show up? Well, first of all, time in nature, we have the opportunity to learn from our ancestors. Robin Wall Kimmerer has a beautiful take on this. You know, these redwoods have been around for a couple thousand years. As a species, they've been around for 250 million years. We've been only around in our current incarnation for about 200,000 years. We've got a lot to learn. Kimmerer recommends that we learn from our ancestors. What do these redwoods have to teach us about resilience? What can they offer to us? What have they experienced that perhaps we need to know? In the natural world, we're also inspired and trained, if you will, in the art of adaptation. I'm going to talk a lot about trees. I'm a Duke forestry grad, so I have a kinship with trees. Look at this tree. What does this have to say to us about adaptation? You know that tree has its story, don't you? It has confronted so many challenges. It had to grow down and sideways and back up again. And perhaps we need to grow down and sideways and back up again. Trees and all aspects of nature can inspire us and teach us about how to adapt to the challenges that climate change faces with us today. This is a tree I ran into on the Potomac River. As you can see, it is growing completely horizontal. Avery's in forestry school. This is not the way trees are supposed to grow, but it had to grow that way. And we need to challenge ourselves to adapt and grow in whatever way we can during this crisis. I love this tree because, as you can see, the branches, which are usually growing horizontal, are looking for the light. They're seeking, they're yearning, they're moving toward the light, even though it has to grow in this very peculiar way. In the natural world, we too can bring our sense of loss and grief, this terror that we're facing as we think and feel and understand about the impacts of climate change. You know, we often go to nature to find comfort, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it's a dangerous place, and it's often a very violent place. It isn't a walk in the park, if you will. A good day for the green heron here, but not such a good day for the fish. Nature is full of destruction and violence, and we can bring our sense of rage and despair and despondency and death and loss to the natural world. The nature gets it. Studies show too that in the natural world we are much more open to compassion, perhaps because of the challenges that we and other creatures face there. This is Amaya Brunet. She was one of the first climate refugees off the coast of Louisiana, she and her family. Time in nature opens us up to compassion, such an important part of showing up and being spiritually resilient. We can also participate, can't we, through compassion in one what might call reciprocal resilience. Not only resilience, practicing resilience for us, but here a scientist is banding a bird off the coast of Louisiana as the Audubon Society was reclaiming the barrier islands. So as we participate in resilience and spiritual resilience through compassion, we can participate in reciprocal resilience for all creatures. Nature also works in community like we could only imagine. And I'm sure many of you have read The Hidden Lives of Trees and are up to snuff on the new science that teaches us that trees are working in community. They send signals of warning back and forth to each other. And they, through these fungal networks that you see here, they are actually able to transfer minerals and food and nurturance to one another. They work together, not only with the same species, but other species and other organisms. Here, the fungi, exceedingly important, I would say essential to the functioning of a healthy forest ecosystem. Nature teaches us about an aspect of spiritual resilience, which is how we must and can continue to work together. In the natural world, too, we can bring these very difficult emotions and be comforted and calm there. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's from a program we did in Pennsylvania. This is a pastor. I know we must have a lot of pastors here. Study after study after study show that nature is a healing place. We can be calmed and comforted there. Our blood pressure decreases. I'm sure most all of you have had this experience in the natural world of being healed there. To Dr. Holton's point about trauma, psychologists are bringing trauma victims into the natural world, encouraging them to plant trees and otherwise restore the earth and thus restoring themselves in the process. We can bring our trauma, our terror, and we can be comforted and healed here. Here too, and so importantly, in the natural world, we experience this transformation that I suggested earlier was a big part of recognizing and understanding spiritual and experiencing spiritual resilience. This is a nurse log. You know, in nature there is, as we know, a great deal of death. I would say death and violence even at the heart of nature, but it never has the final word in the natural world. It is almost always, if not always, purposeful. Here, a dead tree, a nurse log, giving birth to ferns and mosses and new trees. Renewal right before our eyes, inspiring us that to know that there can and will be renewal during the midst of this climate crisis. Buds are setting now in the fall where I live in the Washington area. These little buds are going to hold everything they need through the darkness and the cold of winter, everything they need for new life in the spring. A reminder of renewal and the possibility of holding that hope, darn it, through the cold and the darkness of our winter days. This is a Serotoninous pine cone. That fire that I showed you earlier, bringing death and devastation, also is essential for opening some pine cones to their seeds. Without the fire, there can be no life for these Serotoninous cones. This is a picture of the woods in Yellowstone National Park a few years after those devastating fires in 1988. Again, you can see the destruction, but also in nature, you can experience firsthand renewal, transformation, such an important aspect of spiritual resilience. And just a quick anecdote. I was invited down last week to go take some folks into the woods. A pastor's grief group was coming down with us. These people had experienced trauma and loss, the loss of children, the loss of husbands. And we came down and we happened upon this tree, and this tree has lost, quite literally lost its heart. It's heartwood. And while this tree will never heal its heartwood, it continues to thrive and grow. And the people with whom I was were greatly comforted and relieved to experience firsthand this damaged, traumatized tree that was still thriving and still growing. Nature finally is that emptying place that I had suggested earlier on was such an important part of nature, of spiritual resilience. It's that place where we can come into the deepest aspects of our being, underneath and below the stress, the tension, the ambiguity, all the things that Dr. Holton mentioned. And we can empty ourselves and open ourselves to this very old and essential way of meeting God in this moment. Denise Levertov, one of my favorite poets, says, "It's not God, it's I'm absent. You're the stream, the fish, the light, the pulsing shadow, the unchanged presence, in whom all moves and changes." In the natural world, we meet God within it. And in so doing, we open ourselves up to God's desires for us, to the courage, to the resilience, to the strength that God offers us to meet this moment fully and openly. Meeting God in nature, our very first way of knowing God. God is our rock. God is living waters. All of this preceding churches and mosques and synagogues and such. And for those of you in the Christian faith, where did Jesus go to meet God? To the wilderness. So how do we do this? Well, that's a whole different presentation. But I would suggest we start by going to nature and opening ourselves there and emptying ourselves there. This is what our little piece of nature in the DC area looks like right now. Whoops, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. To walk into nature openly and emptying. We have a few resources that we can offer you, and Annika is going to put the link for this in the chat room. Inside Out is 50 spiritual practices that you can bring into nature as you seek resilience, as you seek to heal, as you seek to take your sense of loss and terror. Spiritual resilience is showing up at its core. We have a number of other resources Annika is going to put in the chat room. We have some helpful hints on our website on how to show up, how we do spiritual practice in nature, how we look for this joy, this disposition. I love that, Dr. Holton, this disposition of joy, and we experience firsthand a spiritual resilience. Avery, I'll turn it back to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. So much to ruminate on and to internalize and take home to our own communities and ministries. I just want to highlight again these definitions of resilience that were shared with us, which alone might be worth the cost of admission here. Hearing from Dr. Holton that resilience is about struggling well, and hearing from Beth that spiritual resilience is showing up. How can we hold these two together? How can we struggle well? And how can we show up as individuals, but even more importantly, as communities, as churches, as congregations? How can we support our people in struggling well and in showing up? It's a challenge for us to take forward with us. Before we move on to the question and answer period, first I want to invite you, if you have questions, please drop those in the chat right now. You'll have a couple moments before we start answering them, so start typing them out so that we're ready to go. But before we get there, I want to share just a practical resource for you all. We heard some great practical resources that we can take back on spirituality and nature, but I want to share here a Faithful Resilience Guide. This is a 6-part guide published by Creation Justice Ministries, and it's a guide to building spiritual, physical, and social climate resilience in your faith community. This is a great starting point if you're looking to talk about climate resilience and resilience in the face of the climate crisis in your faith community. This is a great place to start. It can be used either as a guide for constructing a sermon series, if you're a member of the clergy, or it can be used as a guide for leading a Bible study group or a small group. Perhaps if you're part of a green team or a green ministry, this is an excellent place to begin. This is available at creationjustice.org/resilience. There's a download link there. It's free. I'll just put that out there right now. It's completely free, so you're welcome to download that. At creationjustice.org/resilience, you'll also find a lot of other really good resilience resources, including the recordings from our previous conversations, a map that addresses the climate church crisis, and you can use that to see how your own congregation might be impacted by different aspects of the climate crisis. So take a look at that website and avail yourself of the Faithful Resilience resource. So we're going to move on to question and answer period now. So again, please post those questions in the chat. I'm going to take some facilitator privilege here and start out with a question of my own. And this is for Dr. Holton. I'm really compelled by your definition of despair as having no future story at all to tell. And that hope can actually be found in seeing that future story of despair, but revising that story and creating a new one. That might be another step there. But I'm just curious, how can we see the despair of the climate crisis as it's just unfolding all around us? And in many cases, personally in our lives, being displaced from hurricanes or wildfires. How might you recommend us to look in the face of that despair while keeping that aperture, that vision of hope open?
Well, I think, thank you, Beth, for your presentation, because I think the answer is right there, right? I mean, watching the ways that nature resists our best efforts to annihilate it is inspiring, right? But honestly, we can be, one of the things that happens to us when we become despairing emotionally, we close in on ourselves and on these are just sort of psychological responses, right? Ruminating on what isn't working. And it's really hard to readjust that vision, right? We can walk through a forest pondering all the things that are wrong and never see what's around us, right? It's the showing up with your eyes open, right? And your heart's open. Find the places where nature shows us that it has struggled well. That may not be the answer, but what that is possibility, right? And I think possibility is that thing that kind of breaks open that space for light to come in and for more possibility to shape itself. Part of it is not, it is not closing our eyes to reality, right? I mean, it's the ability to hold that reality no matter how despairing and still see hope. I guess that's what I would say. I don't know if that's helpful, but
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that vision of fixing our eyes on reality. You know, it's clear that one of the challenges that we're facing right now is the denial of reality. And so, and of course that makes sense because it's a psychological response, but that's not a way to grieve in the long term, and that's certainly not a way to cast vision. But
the resilience in nature is also a reality, right? So it's holding those together. Yeah.
Great. So we have a question from Facebook. This is live streaming on Facebook. So this is from Father Yepram. He says, a disturbing thought. I think nonetheless there's a critical mass of people feeling trauma due to what we are doing to the climate. I don't think people will seek a spiritual response. And then he asks your thoughts on this. I'll open that for either presenters.
Well, I would just start. I could not agree more that it goes back to what Dr. Holton said about having our eyes wide open, and that takes a courage. And how do we encourage people to do that? Perhaps Dr. Holton has some words. Certainly, time and nature. It's very difficult to ignore what's happening in the natural world when you're out there. And so when in the talks, when I do on a number of talks on climate over the years, people say, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And you have a lot of ideas in your workbook about that, Avery. But I always suggest that the first thing to do is to go outside, because it's evident there. It's very difficult not to see it out there. And not only climate, but species extirpation and all the other things that we're doing. At the same time, all entangled, as you could see in that nurse log, death and life, all brought together. And so perhaps it would be easier to, less complicated and less denying if we took to nature to look both for the death and the life concurrently, which is so apparent in the natural world. So perhaps one way of getting people to look at the trauma is to see both sides of the equation concurrently.
Yeah, I would add into that. I think, their critical mass makes me think there are millions and millions of people suffering from climate violence. And so it begs the question in me, what does it take, right? And then the sad truth is it's the critical mass that accompanies economic loss, which is unfortunately the way our world works. Which circles me back around to justice making, right? And so I don't have answers about that, but I have, Beth, you made me start thinking about this. I've been doing some work on social empathy. What is it? How is it we can help others build empathy for those very different from themselves? But when you said meet your community, which is nature, how is it that we build a kind of social empathy with nature that helps us think not as we would think, but as the natural world thinks? So, which means leveling our interests over the gifts of the natural world and what it needs to thrive. Yeah, I'm gonna have to work on that a little bit, but that's what it makes me think of.
I just should point out there are a lot of wonderful comments in the chat room that we can't respond to all of them, but this someone commented earlier that we so often, certainly in our faith communities, as well as our secular communities, we tend to separate the physical and the spiritual, the material and the spiritual, and everything in the biblical imperative encourages us not to do that from the very first aspect of our creation when God breathes into us, ruach, wind, spirit, breath. There's a mingling of spirit and physicality. And for those of you in the Christian faith, that first part of the Gospel of John that says everything was created through the Christ. And so it's all enmeshed and it's all entangled. And there are lots of reasons, and Platonism and Neoplatonism and all manner of different ways that we got sidetracked. But to begin to see God entangled in the natural world, to not separate the physical and the spiritual, to begin to understand our community differently, as Dr. Holton suggested. We had a little conversation beforehand about redefining what we mean of community, what we might mean, what Martin Luther King would say now about beloved community. No, very, very important.
Can I bring in another word of Hebrew? Bara, which is to create.
Yeah.
Right? But that word is only used with God, right? Whatever we think we're creating, it's God that's creating what is around us, right? Yeah. Our presumptions are brought back down to size scripturally. Yeah. Someone who knows Hebrew better than I do may have more to say about that, but that has stuck with me. Amazing.
I wish we could continue this conversation. We're just about at time. Thank you for all of the engagement in the chat. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but thank you for all of the questions and comments.
Just very quickly, Avery, my email is, I've put it in. If anybody wants to continue this conversation, I would love to continue it. I'll put my email in the chat.
Great, thank you, Beth. Just so you all know, a piece on logistics, we will share the recording of this video. We'll send that out in an email to everyone next week, and I'll be sure to include all of the resources that have been shared as a part of this discussion, because I know there's a lot of good stuff shared here. As our closing, we have a song, and you're welcome to stay on as long as you want to listen to the song or hop off as you need. This is by the group Climbing Poetry, and the song title is They're Selling the Rain. So enjoy this song, and this will be our closing. So listen, and then we'll close out after this.
Oshima, it's been snowing in the desert, y'all. Something is wrong here. The rivers don't run like they used to. Stay calm. This is an emergency. I tell you if I knew, but the future hasn't said a word to me. She's angry that her children won't be born debt-free. Destiny said man-made curses are her worst pet peeve. They are selling the rain. They are leasing the rivers.
They are auctioning off the oceans
to the highest bidders.
as giant chunks of the polar ice cap
Dislodged from the North Pole, and tourists flock to the site to take pictures.
There is disaster tourism.
Like there's disaster profiteering
Off the torrential storms
and the warring
and the wrath
of global warming. Who
will get paid to rebuild.
and who will they build for?
Who will endure the drought and the rain?
Who will be safe and sound indoors?
Who built the missiles?
The smart bombs,
the rockets?
who gets raided,
And who gets paid
from whose pockets? Who gets sent off to war? Who dies for whose profits? Who gets remembered? Who's been forgotten?
Who paved concrete over the pores of the earth
To make our lives harder and build buildings to scrape skies, trying to get closer to God, but move farther.
our history's been lost to forgetfulness,
Erased by the frontiers of manifest destiny,
as if
destiny were man-made or manifested in the hands
of colonial planners
who build their thrones atop the remains of nations like gravestones. Celebrate Columbus Day
with clearance sales
to buy up stuff to cover up that which cannot be bought or sold, only stolen,
like breath
or life or home or an entire people who once believed that land could never be owned.
and the ocean is worth more than gold.
And water cannot be held captive.
It will reshape
Even stone,
and even when the last tree stands alone,
it still makes a sound long after it's fallen in a forest that lived, even if no one saw it, and fed the world its breath.
whether or not we applauded.
One hand clapping sounds a lot
Like the rhythms
we lost in generations who sang
even as they
departed.
And now we stand
At the doorway, in the hallway, life brought us
to this crossroads
of lost hope and undeniable promise,
where we choose
between paths beyond rightness or wrongness
that will lead to the brink
of the planet's exhaustion or the age of compassion,
where the meek
become strongest and re-inherit the earth and redefine progress.
Thank you all. Peace and resilience be with you as you go out into the world to do this good work.